The year is 1919. The First World War has ended. German troops from across Eastern Europe have been ordered to return home. Many of these soldiers were stationed in Ober-Ost, German-occupied Latvia, Lithuania, and eastern Poland. This was a hotly contested region, with new nations springing up all over the place, all ready to viciously fight for their territorial claims. German leadership knows that such a rapid withdrawal could only lead to chaos, but nothing could be done about it. The Germans had to leave, and when they did, soldiers from all sides poured into the vacuum. The two most important of these land-grabbing nations were Poland and the Soviet Union. Both claimed Ukraine, Belarus, and many other parts of Eastern Europe as their own. Soldiers from each side made contact at the township of Bereza Kartuska. A brief engagement followed. When it was over, the Poles took the town and captured 80 Bolshevik troops. The Polish-Soviet War has begun. So you can call me Ezekiel. This is the Polish-Soviet War. Let's jump in! When the war started in 1919, the Poles had every advantage. Soldiers were arriving into the country from all over the world. Most were veterans who gained their experience fighting for every major power of the First World War. This rapidly growing army had almost 200,000 men by the middle of 1919. Meanwhile, even though the Red Army was technically larger than Poland's, most of it was stuck fighting in the ongoing Russian Civil War, so they only stationed 46,000 of their lowest quality troops on the western border. Against such overwhelming forces, the Bolsheviks could only make a fighting retreat. But the Poles had claims against more than just Russia. In April, they took Bolshevik-held Wilno. Lithuanian nationalists wanted the city for their capital, but the Poles wanted to bring Lithuania into a federation, so refused to cede any territory to it. The Lithuanians tried to take the city by force, but made no progress. Meanwhile, in the south, the Poles destroyed a Ukrainian nationalist government to take the city of Lvov. Before the end of the year, the Poles conducted two more important operations. They captured the key city of Minsk in Belarus, and conducted a joint operation with Latvia against the Bolsheviks to enforce Latvian claims. This time, the Poles handed the land over to them, turning Latvia into one of Poland's closest allies in the region. All of this would set the terms for the coming battle in 1920. The Poles had made enemies of the Lithuanians, and while Lvov was a valuable city, the Ukrainian government there acted as a buffer between the Poles and the Bolsheviks. By destroying it, the Poles doubled the length of their front line. The onset of winter caused an end to the fighting. The Bolsheviks spent this period finishing the Civil War, while Poland courted foreign support. They had some success with the French and Americans, but the British really disliked them. British leadership was upset with the Poles for not attacking sooner, when they would have helped the White Army take Moscow. As winter ended, it wasn't totally clear to anyone whether Poland and the Soviet Union were still at war. So far, the fighting was taking place in an undefined frontier. There was a brief attempt to resolve the conflict diplomatically, but frankly, both sides wanted war. They had plenty of historical, ideological, and geographic grudges to settle. The only real question was who would strike first. The Poles carefully assessed their situation. The Red Army hadn't beaten the Southern Whites yet, so their forces on the Polish border were still weak. On top of that, the Poles had a unique opportunity to form a friendly government in Ukraine. During the last year's fighting, Petliura, a Ukrainian nationalist, fled the country, and was now under Polish protection. If the Poles took Kiev, he could set up a pro-Polish government and raise a Ukrainian army. For all of those reasons, the Poles chose to make a preemptive strike. The plan was to rapidly encircle and destroy the Soviet troops on the border, and then rush to Kiev so Petliura could establish a government. Right before the attack, the Bolsheviks were struck by a wave of white and black partisan attacks, and one Soviet brigade even mutinied to join the Polish, so when the campaign began, Soviet forces had to retreat. This was not actually what the Poles had wanted. Remember, their goal was to surround and destroy the Bolsheviks. But the Polish army did at least take most of western Ukraine, and were in Kiev on the 7th of May. It was time for Petliura to raise his army. But as it turned out, the man was absolutely incompetent. Petliura failed to set up an effective civil administration, and was unable to recruit significant numbers of troops. So in spite of their massive ground gains, the Polish offensive was a failure. They neither destroyed the Soviet armies, nor created a useful Ukrainian ally. Instead, they found themselves occupying a hostile country many miles from home. Now, preemptive strikes can be very powerful. A well-timed surprise offensive directed at the heart of your enemy can end a war in a matter of weeks, or even days, but they come with significant downsides. Preemptive strikes make you the aggressor, uniting your enemies and alienating your friends. If the strike fails to inflict significant damage, it can destroy you. That's nearly what happened to Poland. The whole world now saw them as the party responsible for the war. And, even worse, the invasion inspired patriotism in the Russian people, uniting them behind their previously unpopular government. The Bolsheviks were actually rather uncomfortable with this. As communists, they were highly suspicious of patriotism, but they still benefited regardless. By the time the Poles took Kiev, the Bolsheviks were mostly finished with the White Movement, freeing hundreds of thousands of soldiers to join the fight against Poland. Their plan was to surround and destroy the Polish army, and then push as deep into Poland as possible. A key unit during this offensive was the Russian Konarmia, a massive all-cavalry force of nearly 20,000 horsemen. This mounted army's job was to find weak spots in the Polish line, break through them, and then wreak havoc in their rear. But before they could do that, they were confronted by the Polish cavalry. On the 29th of May, near Wolodarka, 3,000 Polish lances met 18,000 Russian sabers. But the two forces didn't fight. The sun was directly behind the Polish cavalry, so the Russians couldn't see that they had the better numbers. So instead of fighting, a strange incident occurred. A Polish lancer describes the scene. Both sides slowed to a walk and came to a standstill facing each other. A colorfully dressed rider galloped out of the swarms of Cossacks on a magnificent black charger, and, waving a saber above his head, shouted, "Well, my lords, I am Cossack Kuzma Khrushchev. Who will take me on?" At this, a murmur ran along the row of officers standing in front of the first lancers. Racheski! Yes, Racheski! Captain Racheski, the best swordsman in the regiment, passed his saber to his left hand to make the sign of the cross with his right, and then began to move towards Khrushchev at a walk. Khrushchev sprang toward him at a gallop. Racheski parried the first cut, aimed at his head, and himself slashed fiercely to the right and down, cutting Khrushchev open from his collar to his waist. At this, a howl went up among the Cossacks. "He's dead! Dead! The devil!" they shouted, and the whole lot turned tail as our regiment began to charge. That's right, they straight up fought a duel, and the Poles won. But in spite of the moral victory, the Polish army was still in a terrible position, so they had to retreat out of Ukraine and Belarus, and back into Poland. In just a few weeks, the Poles found themselves run to the outskirts of Warsaw. While all of this was going on, the Polish government was hard at work. They dedicated themselves to reinforcing the army with huge numbers of conscripts and volunteers. There was even a large women's corps to free men from auxiliary duties. By August, when the decisive battle would take place, the Polish army had over 700,000 troops. And while the Polish army was getting stronger, the Red Army was falling apart. Soviet leadership was well aware of what happens when you stretch your supply lines too far, and while they did everything they could to repair infrastructure behind them, there was a limit to what that could accomplish. It's important to note that the Bolsheviks did not believe their army was strong enough to conquer all of Eastern Europe by itself. Instead, they believed that the advance of the Red Army would inspire the workers to rise up wherever it went, causing it to grow stronger with its advance. This concept had been proven during the Russian Civil War, but that war was fought entirely within the Russian nation. But now outside of Russia, it wasn't possible to convince foreign soldiers and civilians to support an invasion of their homeland. So when the climactic battle came, the Reds were far weaker than they expected to be. The battle for Warsaw would not be decided by brilliant generals conducting skillful maneuvers. Instead, it would be a multi-day brawl, during which basically no one knew what was happening. The most either side could do was deploy their soldiers on the best ground available, and hope that they'd perform well. As the day of the battle neared, the Poles conducted a last-second reorganization of their forces. This was an impressive feat, since it involved moving massive army formations who were exhausted by 5 weeks of retreat. Many were still busy fighting the enemy, but when it was all over, the Polish forces south of Warsaw were in place to conduct a counterattack. They only needed the order. The Reds began the battle with an assault against the forces defending Warsaw. This attack was moderately successful, which concerned the Polish leadership. They thought this meant that the Red Army was stronger than they had estimated. In response, they ordered their counterattack a day early. Shortly after the counterattack began, their leadership lost all contact with them. This was not because the counterattack had failed, but because it succeeded beyond all expectations. It turned out that the Red Army was much smaller than the Poles had estimated, so breakthroughs happened quickly, and with few reserve troops to oppose them, the Polish divisions were able to race north. The Bolsheviks retreated to avoid encirclement, but for much of their forces, it was too late. In their effort to surround the Red Army, some Polish units had to march hundreds of kilometers with barely 4 hours of sleep a night, even fighting battles along the way. But it was worth it. By the 25th of August, the battle was over. The Polish army reached the German border at East Prussia. They took 50,000 prisoners, killed 25,000 Russians, and forced between 30 and 80,000 Bolshevik troops to cross into Germany and surrender themselves. After the battle, the Poles were exhausted. This gave both sides time to rest and reorganize. The Russians created a defensive line south of Lithuania. They thought that the neutral and friendly Lithuania would be a sufficient obstacle to secure their northern flank. But they were wrong. The Poles did not recognize Wilno as legitimate Lithuanian territory, so they had no compunctions about crossing this unrecognized border to get at the Russian rear. So due to a diplomatic misunderstanding, the Russian defenses were defeated by the Poles, and they were forced to retreat once again. By this point, the Russian ability to resist the Polish army was totally spent. All they could do was make a fighting retreat deeper into friendly territory, but Bolshevik leaders insisted that they stay and fight for as long as possible. An armistice was planned to take place in the middle of October. This made the rest of the war a race for the Polish to occupy as much land as possible. As planned, the fighting stopped in October of 1920, and a full peace was concluded at Riga in March of 1921. Poland's success in the Polish-Soviet War was somewhat of an embarrassment for the Western Allies, particularly the United Kingdom, who was still bitter over Poland's lack of support for the Russian White movement. But Poland's reward was an enlarged eastern border, including parts of western Belarus and Ukraine. But that wasn't anywhere near Poland's real goal of an Eastern European Federation, or even a restored Commonwealth, and Poland's attempts to realize those ambitions turned most of their neighbors against them. Remember, while the war with the Soviets was going on, Poland was also pursuing its claims on disputed territory with Germany and Czechoslovakia. When it was all over, Poland's only friendly neighbors were Latvia and Romania. Meanwhile, they were never on the best terms with the United Kingdom, and while the French still liked Poland, well, they weren't exactly there when Poland needed them most. Poland's actions during this war help explain why it was neither able to form an alliance with its neighbors, nor get much support from the Allies during World War II, dooming the region to both Nazi occupation and the communist rule that followed. And that's the Polish-Soviet War. Don't forget to like this video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. And if you'd like to help us make more videos like this one, support us through Patreon, Subscribestar, becoming a channel member, and PayPal, links to all of which can be found below. Up next, we're going to visit Russia one more time, and take a look at one of the most unique armed movements to fight in the Russian Civil War. I'm especially excited for it, because Huliaipoli is a fun word to say. I'll see you then.
Żal, żal za dziewczyną, za zieloną Ukrainą, żal, żal.